Did you know that the entire timeline of the Battle of the Bulge was shattered by 22 men who didn't know they were supposed to retreat? My name is Jack, and this is my audiobook narrative about the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge. In the grand calculus of World War II, a battalion of 500 elite German paratroopers should mathematically erase a single American reconnaissance platoon in less than 30 minutes. The manuals dictate a 3-to-1 ratio for an assault. At Lanzerath on December 16, 1944, the ratio was 25-to-1. But math does not account for the specific geometry of a frozen ridge in Belgium. It does not account for a 20-year-old lieutenant named Lyle Bouck, who refused to run. And it certainly does not account for the 18 hours of chaos that ensued when the tip of Hitler's spear ran into a piece of grit it could not dislodge. This is not a story about a massive army clashing with another. This is a story about a single road junction, a few foxholes, and the difference between a map and the terrain. To understand why 18 infantrymen and 4 artillery observers became the most important unit in Europe for a single day, we have to look at the map of the Ardennes in December 1944. The Allies called it the Ghost Front. For months, this 70-mile stretch of forest and hills along the German-Belgian border was where the American Army sent units to heal or units to learn. If you were a division that had been chewed up in the Hürtgen forest, you came here to lick your wounds. If you were a brand new division, fresh from the States, you came here to get your boots muddy in a sector where nothing happened. The logic was sound, or so the generals thought. The terrain was awful. The road network was sparse, the hills were steep, and the forests were dense. No sane commander would launch a mechanized offensive through the Ardennes in winter. In 1940, the Germans had done exactly that to conquer France, but Allied intelligence reasoned that lightning doesn't strike the same tree twice. They were wrong. The German plan, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was a desperate, psychotic gamble. Hitler scraped together the last reserves of his armor and elite infantry. His goal was to punch a hole in the thin American line, race across the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. This would split the British and American armies in half, starve them of supplies, and force a negotiated peace. Speed was the only variable that mattered. The entire operation operated on a timetable measured in minutes. The Panzer armies had to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours. If they got stuck in the mud, or if they got stuck fighting insignificant platoons in insignificant villages, the fuel would run out, the skies would clear, and the Allied air power would incinerate them. The northern shoulder of this attack was assigned to the 6th Panzer Army, led by the fanatical SS general Sepp Dietrich. His spearhead was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a terrifying column of King Tiger tanks and SS Panzer Grenadiers. Peiper was a man who did not stop for anything. His orders were to bypass resistance, run over anything in his way, and keep the tracks moving west. But tanks cannot fly. They need roads. And in the northern Ardennes, there was one specific road that Peiper needed. It ran through the Losheim Gap. And sitting right on the edge of that gap, overlooking the crucial intersection, was the tiny village of Lanzerath. On December 10, 1944, the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, 99th Infantry Division, arrived in Lanzerath. The 99th was a checkboard division. They were green. They had arrived in Europe in November. Most of the men had never heard a shot fired in anger. They were kids. The oldest man in the platoon was 24. The youngest were 18 or 19. Their commander was First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck. He was 20 years old. Bouck was not your typical officer. He had enlisted in the National Guard at 14. He was a sergeant at 16. By the time the war started, he was drilling men twice his age. He was efficient, serious, and possessed a level of tactical maturity that baffled his superiors. But he was still just 20. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, or INR, was not a line infantry unit. They were specialists. Their job was to sneak, peek, and report. They were trained to drive jeeps deep into no man's land, sketch enemy positions, and get out before the shooting started. They were armed with M1 carbines, light weapons meant for self-defense, not for holding ground against a battalion assault. When they arrived at Lanzerath, Bouck didn't like what he saw. The village consisted of about 23 houses and a church. It sat in a valley. The road ran right through it. To the northwest of the village, there was a ridge that rose up about 30 feet above the road. It was covered in a dense pine forest. The previous unit in this sector, the 2nd Infantry Division, had dug foxholes along the edge of the tree line on that ridge, but they had done a sloppy job. The holes were shallow. The fields of fire were clogged with brush. Bouck looked at the position and shook his head. He ordered his men to dig. "If we have to fight here," he told them, "we are going to be ready." For 5 days, the boys of the INR platoon transformed that ridge. They dug the foxholes deeper, covering them with heavy logs and earth to protect against tree bursts, shrapnel that rains down when artillery hits the pine canopy. They cleared the underbrush in front of their positions to create clear lanes of fire. They didn't just clear it randomly. They cut it at knee height so an attacking soldier would have to step over it, slowing him down for just a second. That second is the difference between a hit and a miss. They scavenged. The INR platoon was famous in the regiment for their acquisitions. They had more firepower than a standard platoon should have. Officially, they had light carbines. Unofficially, Bouck had traded captured German souvenirs for a .50 caliber Browning machine gun, a weapon that could punch through a brick wall or an engine block. He had mounted it on a jeep. He dug a pit for the jeep on the right flank of the position, hull down, so only the gun was visible. They had a .30 caliber light machine gun on the left flank. They had bars, Browning automatic rifles scattered in the center. They had a collection of grenades that they kept in crates next to their holes. The men griped about the digging. The ground was freezing. The temperature hovered around 30 degrees during the day and dropped to 20 at night. The mist was constant. It soaked into their wool coats and numbed their fingers. They built a small log hut behind the foxhole line to use as a warming station and command post. They rotated in and out, drying their socks, heating K rations, and trying to stay warm, but it was quiet. This was the ghost front. To their south, there was a massive gap in the American lines. The 106th Infantry Division, another green unit, was miles away. To their north, the rest of the 99th Division was spread thin. The INR platoon was effectively plugging a 5-mile hole with 18 men. Bouck wasn't comfortable with the isolation. He set up observation posts. He ran patrols. but mostly they waited. On the night of December 15th, the silence changed. Private William Sakanikas, known to everyone as Sak, was on guard duty. Sak was a Greek-American kid from New York, tough, aggressive, and fiercely loyal to Bouck. He was the kind of soldier who would complain about the food, but would charge a machine gun nest if you asked him to. Sak heard engines. It wasn't the usual sound of a truck or two resupplying the lines. This was a deep, guttural thrumming that vibrated the ground. It was the sound of tracks, lots of tracks. He woke Bouck. They stood in the freezing darkness, listening. "It sounds like a conveyor belt," Sak whispered. "Like a factory." Bouck called battalion headquarters. "I hear armor," he said. "Lots of it, moving into position." The voice on the other end was dismissive. "It's probably just the Krauts playing records over loudspeakers to scare you kids. Go back to sleep." Bouck didn't go back to sleep. He knew the difference between a recording and a Panther tank. At 05:30 a.m. on December 16th, the horizon behind the German lines turned into a strobe light. The artillery barrage that opened the Battle of the Bulge was one of the heaviest of the war. For 90 minutes, the sky fell on the Ardennes. The 99th Division, spread out in their quiet sector, was hammered. Trees shattered. The ground erupted. But, miraculously, most of the shells went over Lanzerath Ridge. The Germans were targeting the artillery positions and command centers deeper in the rear. The INR platoon huddled in their log-covered foxholes, listening to the freight trains screaming overhead. When the shelling stopped at 7 a.m., the silence was worse than the noise. The mist was thick. Visibility was less than 200 yards. The world was gray and white and cold. Bouck tried the field phone. Dead. The lines had been cut by the barrage. He tried the radio. Static. Down in the village of Lanzerath, there was a small unit of American tank destroyers, towed 3-inch guns attached to the 14th Cavalry Group. They were supposed to be the heavy support. Around 8:00 a.m., Bouck saw the tank destroyer crews hitching up their guns. They were pulling out. He ran down the hill to their commander. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "We're bugging out," the officer said. "We're taking fire, and we have orders to withdraw." "We're staying," Bouck said. "Can you leave us a radio? Ours is out." The officer shook his head. "Can't spare it." They drove off, the engines fading into the mist. Now they were truly alone. The INR platoon, 18 men. A few minutes later, 4 figures emerged from the mist. They were Americans. Lieutenant Warren Springer and 3 enlisted men. They were forward artillery observers from the 371st Field Artillery Battalion. Their battery had displaced, and they had been left behind. "Join us," Bouck said. "We have foxholes." The count was now 22. Bouck gathered his squad leaders, Slape, the technical sergeant who was the backbone of the platoon, Milosevic, the sharp-eyed shooter. "We are going to stay put," Bouck told them. His voice was calm, the voice of a man who had already accepted the reality of the situation. "Our orders are to hold and report. We can't report, so we hold." He distributed the ammo. He checked the 50 cal. He placed the men in pairs. "Don't fire until I give the signal," he ordered. "We let them get close. We want them in the open." The mist began to lift slightly around 10 a.m. From their position on the ridge, they had a perfect view of the road coming from the east into Lanzerath. It was a long, gentle slope leading into the village. Then they saw them. It wasn't a tank column, it was infantry. They were walking down the road in a double column. They weren't crouching. They weren't using cover. They were marching as if they were on a training exercise in Bavaria. They were laughing. Some of them had their rifles slung over their shoulders. These were the men of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, paratroopers. In the early years of the war, the Fallschirmjägers were the elite of the elite, the Green Devils. They had captured Crete. They had held Monte Cassino. By late 1944, the division was not quite what it used to be. Many of the veterans were dead. The ranks had been filled with Luftwaffe ground crews and younger conscripts. But they were still paratroopers. They were aggressive, well-armed, and numbered over 500 men in this first wave. They had no idea the Americans were there. The German commander, confident that the artillery had wiped out any resistance, was marching his men straight into a kill zone. Up on the ridge, 22 hearts hammered against 22 rib cages. Bouck lay in his foxhole, the cold wood of his carbine stock pressed against his cheek. He watched the column get closer. 500 yards, 400 yards, 300 yards. He could see their faces now. He could see the gray of their uniforms. He could see the breath steaming in the cold air. Beside him, Sack was trembling, not from fear, but from adrenaline. He had the barrel of his rifle tracking the lead officer. The Germans reached the edge of the village. They paused. A few of them lit cigarettes. The arrogance of it was staggering. They thought the Americans had run away. They thought the road to the Meuse was open. Bouck took a deep breath. He looked down the line of foxholes. He couldn't see his men, well hidden under the pine boughs. But he knew they were there. He knew they were sighting in. He waited until the bulk of the column was fully exposed on the road. He didn't shout a dramatic speech. He simply squeezed the trigger. The crack of Bouck's carbine was the starting gun for the most violent ambush of the Ardennes offensive. For a split second, the Germans froze. Then the ridge exploded. The 50 caliber machine gun, manned by Corporal McGeehee, opened up with a sound like a jackhammer. The heavy rounds tore through the German column, shredding bodies and turning the neatly ordered formation into a charnel house. The bars chattered. The Garands pinged. The Germans on the road didn't die for cover. They dropped because they were dead. The survivors scrambled into the ditches, screaming, confused, firing wildly into the trees. They couldn't see where the fire was coming from. The INR platoon was using smokeless powder. The ridge was just a wall of noise and death. Bouck fired until his magazine was empty, reloaded, and fired again. He saw the German officer he had aimed at crumple. "Keep it up," he yelled, though no one could hear him over the roar of the 50 cal. "Pour it on." The initial ambush lasted only minutes, but the devastation was total. The road was littered with gray heaps. The German advance had stopped cold. But this was just the beginning. Down in the village, the German commanders were screaming orders. They realized this wasn't just a stray patrol. They were facing a prepared position. They began to deploy. Mortar teams set up behind the houses. Machine gun teams started to work their way up the flanks. The 500 men of the 1st Battalion, 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment were waking up, and they were angry. Bouck watched them regroup. He saw the officers pointing up at the ridge. He checked his watch. It was not even noon yet. They had poked the bear. Now the bear was coming up the hill. The silence that followed The initial ambush was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a deep breath before a scream. Down on the road, the gray heaps didn't move. But in the ditches and behind the stone walls of Lanzerath, the hive was buzzing. The German officers were furious. To them, this was a mathematical error, a minor obstruction. They assumed they had hit a company-sized element, maybe a battalion rear guard. They had no idea they were being pinned down by less than 24 kids who were supposed to be watching with binoculars, not fighting with machine guns. At 11 a.m., the whistle blew. This was not a probe. This was a frontal assault. From the tree line, Buck saw them rise, not in a column this time, but in a skirmish line. They came straight up the hill, shouting, firing MP-40 submachine guns from the hip. They were trying to use brute force to overwhelm the ridge. "Here they come," Sack yelled. The distance between the road and the foxholes was about 200 yards of open, snow-covered pasture. To cross it, a man had to expose himself for 30 seconds. In modern warfare, 30 seconds is a lifetime. Buck waited again. He had to conserve ammunition. Every bullet had to be in exchange for a life. "Wait for it," he muttered. The Germans hit the halfway point. They were screaming, "Hände hoch! Hands up!" The response from the ridge was a unified volley of 30 ISO-6 rounds. The first wave of the assault disintegrated. The INR platoon had cleared those fields of fire perfectly. They were shooting at knee level. If a German soldier ducked, he was hit. If he stood, he was hit. But these were paratroopers. They didn't break. They went to ground and started crawling. They worked their way up inch by inch, using the folds in the snowy ground. On the left flank, Private Milosevic, the platoon sniper, was at work. He wasn't firing rapidly. He was taking slow, rhythmic shots. Crack, pause, crack. He was targeting the NCOs, the squad leaders, the men shouting orders. "I got the one with the black binoculars," he called out calmly. On the right flank, the 56 caliber Jeep was the anchor. Corporal McGeehee was feathering the trigger, firing in short bursts to keep the barrel from overheating. The heavy rounds were chewing through the trees the Germans were using for cover. The assault stalled. The Germans pulled back, leaving more bodies on the slope. The snow was beginning to turn red. Inside the foxholes, the mood was a mix of exhilaration and terror. They had held. But the math was starting to weigh on them. "How much ammo we got left?" Slape asked. "Enough for now," Bouck said. But he knew now was a fleeting concept. They had started the day with a standard loadout, plus whatever they had scrounged. They didn't have a resupply truck. They didn't have a rear echelon. Once the crates were empty, they were just men with metal clubs. Then a glimmer of hope. Lieutenant Springer, the artillery observer, had managed to splice a radio wire. He had a connection to the 371st Field Artillery Battalion. "I have targets in the open," Springer shouted into the handset. "Coordinates follow. Enemy infantry in battalion strength. Requests immediate fire mission." The voice on the other end was distant, crackling with static. "Negative," the voice said. "The battery is displacing. We are on the move. We cannot fire." Springer stared at the handset. "You don't understand," he pleaded. "We are stopping a major offensive here. If you give us a barrage, we can wipe them out." "Negative. All units are moving rearward." The line went dead. Springer looked at Bouck. The look on his face said everything. "We are on our own. There would be no cavalry. There would be no thunder from the sky. The 99th Division was collapsing all around them, retreating to the Elsenborn Ridge. The INR platoon was a lonely island in a sea of retreat. At 2:09 p.m., the Germans changed tactics. They stopped trying to run up the middle. They split. One group moved to the left flank, trying to use a sunken road to get behind the platoon. Another group moved to the right. This was the danger. The INR platoon was spread out over a frontage of about 150 yards. If the Germans got around the sides, they could roll up the line like a carpet. "Sack, take the left," Bouck ordered. Chicanicus grabbed his Thompson submachine gun. He didn't stay in his hole. He jumped out, running, crouched along the back of the ridge line to reinforce the left flank. He was exposing himself to mortar fire that was now starting to rain down on them, but he didn't care. He reached the left flank just as a squad of Germans popped up from the sunken road. Sack opened up at point-blank range. The Thompson bucked in his hands. He dropped 2 Germans instantly. The others scrambled back. Get back," Sack screamed, his voice raw. On the right, the pressure was mounting on the jeep. The Germans were focusing their mortar fire on it. They knew it was the heavy hitter. A shell landed close. Shrapnel pinged off the metal shield of the 50 cal. McGeehee ducked, wiped dirt from his eyes, and came back up, firing. He was running low on belts. "I need ammo," he shouted. Private Silvela ran from a center foxhole carrying a crate of 50 caliber rounds. He sprinted through the tree bursts, dirt geysering up around his boots. He slid into the pit next to McGeehee. "Load me," McGeehee yelled. They kept the gun singing. The second assault lasted for 45 minutes. It was closer than the first. The Germans got within 50 yards of the foxholes. The Americans could hear them cursing. They could hear the bolts of their rifles clicking. But again, the volume of fire from the ridge was just too intense. The INR platoon was firing as if they were a company. They were moving between foxholes to make it seem like there were more of them. The Germans broke again. As they retreated down the hill, the battlefield grew quiet once more. Now we must zoom out. We have to look at the clock. It was nearly 3:10 p.m. In the original German timetable, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the EK tanks, was supposed to be through Lanzerath by 08 a.m. They were 7 hours behind schedule. 7 hours. In a blitzkrieg, 7 hours is the difference between victory and defeat. Miles. Back to the east, the roads were a nightmare. The German supply columns were gridlocked. The massive King Tiger tanks, gas-guzzling monsters, were idling, burning precious fuel. Joachim Peiper, the SS commander, was raging. He drove his command vehicle up the line, demanding to know why they weren't moving. Resistance at Lanzerath, he was told. Strong American resistance. Peiper assumed he was facing a fortified line held by a regiment of tanks and anti-tank guns. He had no idea that the strong resistance was Lyle Bouck and a bunch of kids sharing cigarettes and counting their last clips of ammunition. If Peiper had known, he would have simply driven his tanks right through the village. The INR platoon had no anti-tank weapons. A single tank could have driven up that road and ended the Saihe battle in 5 minutes. But Peiper didn't know. The fog of war, generated by the sheer volume of fire from those 22 rifles, had created an illusion of strength. The psychological impact of the INR platoon was far greater than their kinetic impact. They were buying time that the Allies didn't even know they needed. Back on the ridge, the sun was starting to dip. The temperature was dropping. The men were exhausted. Their faces were black with gunpowder residue. Their shoulders ached from the recoil. Bouck crawled from hole to hole. "Check your ammo," he whispered. "I've got 2 clips left," one man said. "I've got 3, said another. "Save them," Bouck said. "Single shots only. Don't fire unless you can see the whites of their eyes." He knew the next one would be the big one. The Germans were done testing. They knew where the flanks were. They knew where the machine guns were. And the light was failing. Darkness favors the attacker. Down in the village, the Americans saw something that made their blood run cold. More trucks, more troops. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment was bringing up its reserves. Another battalion. Now, it wasn't just 22 against 500. It was 22 against an entire regiment. Bouck looked at Slape. Slape looked at Bouck. "We could bug out," Slape said quietly. "We could slip out the back through the woods. No one would blame us. We did our job." Bouck looked at the map. He looked at the road behind them. He knew that if they left, the road was open. "Not yet," Bouck said. "We hold until we can't." It was a suicide pact made without a handshake. At 4 p.m., the sun touched the horizon. The shadows stretched long and dark across the snow. Then the world turned purple. The Germans had brought up a flak wagon, a vehicle mounted with a 20 anti-aircraft gun. They lowered the barrels to fire horizontally. They weren't aiming at planes. They were aiming at the foxholes. The sound of a 20-millimeter flak gun firing at ground targets is not a bang. It is a rhythmic, mechanical coughing. Chug, 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 chug. Each shell is the size of a large carrot. It is explosive. When it hits a tree, it doesn't just embed itself in the wood, it shatters the trunk. At 4:30 p.m., the ridgeline began to disintegrate. The Germans walked the fire of the flak wagon back and forth across the American positions. The heavy logs covering the foxholes splintered. Branches rained down like jagged spears. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that hammered against the eardrums. Under this umbrella of high explosive noise, the German infantry surged forward for the 3rd and final time. This was not a skirmish line. This was a flood. They came from the front. They came from the left flank. They came from the right flank. The twilight rendered them as dark shapes, a moving shadow that was closing the noose. Bouck grabbed the field phone, praying for a miracle connection to artillery. "Give us everything you have. On my position. Wipe us out if you have." "2, just stop them." The line was dead static. "Sack!" Bouck screamed. "How many rounds?" "I'm out!" Sakanicus yelled back. He was wounded, bleeding from the face, but he was still trying to fire his Thompson. The bolt clicked on an empty chamber. He grabbed a grenade, pulled the pin, and hurled it into the darkness. On the right flank, the 50 caliber machine gun finally fell silent. It wasn't jammed. It was empty. Corporal McGehee had fired thousands of rounds. He had turned the barrel white hot, but you cannot shoot without bullets. McGehee and his loader, Silvola, scrambled back toward the command post. "They're flanking us on the right. They're in the trees." The INR platoon was no longer fighting a battle. They were fighting for the next 5 seconds of their lives. Men were pulling their 45 caliber pistols. These are weapons effective at 20 yards. The Germans were at 15. "Destroy the guns," Bouck ordered. It is the most painful order a soldier can give or receive, to break the tool that has kept you alive. Men smashed the sights of their bars against rocks. They pulled the trigger groups out of their M1s and buried them in the mud. They threw the bolts of the machine guns into the snow. They would not let the Germans turn these weapons against the next American unit. Then the firing stopped. It didn't taper off. It stopped because there was nothing left to shoot. The silence that rushed back into the vacuum was terrifying. In that silence, they heard the crunch of jackboots on snow. They heard the slide of German bolts, racking rounds. A voice called out from the darkness, just feet away, "Surrender! Come out!" It was over. Bouck looked at his men. They were battered, frozen, deafened, and bleeding. But amazingly, only one man, Private Khalil, was seriously wounded, shot in the jaw. 14 others had minor wounds. They had held off a regiment for 18 hours. They had fired every single bullet they had. "Okay," Bouck whispered. "That's it." He stood up, hands raised. From the shadows, the Fallschirmjägers emerged. They were wary. They kept their weapons trained on the Americans, fingers on triggers. They expected a trick. They expected a regiment to pop out of the ground. A German non-commissioned officer approached Bouck. He shined a flashlight in Bouck's face. He looked at the boys of the INR platoon. He looked at the pile of spent brass that was ankle-deep around the foxholes. Then he looked past them, into the woods behind the ridge. "Where are the others?" the German asked in broken English. Bouck looked him in the eye. "There are no others." The German frowned. He didn't understand. "The rest of your unit, the battalion. Where are they?" "This is it," Bouck said. "Just us." The German soldier lowered his flashlight. He shone it on the line of 22 men. Then he shone it back on the hundreds of his own comrades gathering on the road and the bodies of the German dead that littered the slope. He turned to his officer, who had just walked up. The officer was furious, checking his watch, his face red with the stress of the delay. The NCO pointed at Bouck and said something in German. The officer froze. He looked at the 22 Americans. He looked at the carnage his unit had suffered. He asked the question again, desperate for it to be a lie. "You alone?" "Yes," Bouck said. The German officer stared. It was a look of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the look of a man who realizes he has spent a fortune to buy a penny. He had just lost an entire day of the Battle of the Bulge. He had spent hundreds of casualties. He had delayed the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, and he had done it to defeat 18 infantrymen and 4 artillery observers. The capture was tense. The SS troops were frustrated and adrenaline-fueled. Sakanikas, even with a wound and no weapon, glared at a German who reached for his watch. The German raised his rifle to smash Sack's skull. Bouck stepped in, between them. He didn't flinch. He just stared the German down. The German lowered his rifle. Even as prisoners, the INR platoon held the psychological high ground. They were marched down into the village of Lanzerath. They were herded into the Café Schultz, the same building that had been their headquarters just hours before. As they sat there, exhausted, listening to the roar of German tanks finally moving up the road outside, the door opened. A tall, menacing figure walked in. He wore the black uniform of the SS. He had the Death's head insignia on his cap. It was Joachim Peiper, the commander of the Spearhead. the man who was supposed to be at the Meuse River by now. He looked at the prisoners. Then he looked at his watch. It was midnight. Peiper turned to the Fallschirmjäger commander. He didn't scream. He spoke with a cold, deadly quiet. You stop for this? He didn't wait for an answer. He stormed out, climbed into his command vehicle, and ordered his column forward. But the damage was done. The clock had ticked. The timeline of the Battle of the Bulge is a delicate chain of events. Because the INR platoon held Lanzerath for 18 hours, Peiper was late. Because Peiper was late, the American engineers at the bridges further west had time to rig them with explosives. Because the bridges were blown, Peiper had to divert. Because he diverted, he ran out of fuel. The chain reaction that would eventually destroy Hitler's last gamble didn't start in the war rooms of London or Washington. It started in a foxhole in Belgium with a 20-year-old lieutenant who decided not to run. The war didn't end for Lyle Bouck and his men that night in the Café Schultz. It simply changed venues. For the next 5 months, they endured the hell of German prisoner of war camps. They suffered from malnutrition, disease, and the bitter cold of a collapsing Reich. Bouck, Sack, and the others were marched east, away from the liberation they had fought so hard to enable. But the cruelest wound wasn't physical, it was psychological. For 37 years, the men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon believed they had failed. They had been ordered to hold. They had been captured. In the binary logic of a soldier, capture feels like defeat. They didn't know about the blown bridges. They didn't know that General Sepp Dietrich was screaming at his commanders because the 6th Panzer Army was stuck in a traffic jam caused by a single platoon. They didn't know that the 99th Division had used those 18 precious hours to fortify the Lanzerath Ridge, the only sector of the Battle of the Bulge where the Germans never broke through. They returned home to an America that was celebrating victory. They went back to their jobs, raised families, and tried to forget the frozen terror of Lanzerath. The army, in the chaos of demobilization, lost their paperwork. The records of their stand were buried in the administrative fog. They were heroes without a history. For decades, the Battle of the Bulge was defined by General Patton's relief of Bastogne, or the 101st Airborne's stubborn defense. Lanzerath was just a dot on a map, a footnote where a German column had been temporarily delayed. It wasn't until the late 1970s that the truth began to surface. Military historians started cross-referencing German logs with American reports. They found a discrepancy. The German record spoke of a ferocious, fortified defense at Lanzerath. The American record showed only a single reconnaissance platoon. The math didn't add up until it did. In 1981, the Army finally convened a hearing. They brought the graying survivors of the INR platoon back together. They listened to the testimony. They looked at the maps. The conclusion was undeniable. On October 26, 1981, 37 years after the fact, the Department of the Army corrected the record. In a ceremony in Washington, D.C., the entire platoon was recognized. First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, now a man in his late 50s, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor. 3 others received the DSC. 5 received Silver Stars. 10 received Bronze Stars with V devices for valor. The platoon was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. Overnight, The INR platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment went from being forgotten to being the most decorated platoon for a single engagement in the history of the United States Army. The recognition was sweet, but the reality was simpler. They hadn't fought for medals. They hadn't fought for history. They had fought for the man in the foxhole next to them. Today, Lanzerath is quiet again. If you visit the ridge, you can still find the depressions in the earth where the foxholes used to be. The pine trees have grown back, tall and silent. The Cafe Schultz is still there, a witness to the night the war stood still. The 1.2 million soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge are almost all gone now. The King Tiger tanks have been scrapped or sit in museums. The maps have been redrawn. But the lesson of Lanzerath Ridge remains timeless. In an age of drone warfare, hypersonic missiles, and algorithmic combat, it is easy to believe that the human element has been rendered obsolete. We assume that victory belongs to the side with the biggest GDP, the most advanced microchips, or the heaviest tonnage of high explosives. The story of Lyle Bouck and his 21 men is a rejection of that assumption. It proves that friction is the only constant in war. It proves that a small group of people operating with limited resources but unlimited resolve can jam the gears of a massive machine. The Germans had the tanks. They had the numbers. They had the momentum of a desperate empire. But on December 16th, 1944, they didn't have the ridge because 18 kids from the 99th Division decided they weren't done using it. Victory is not always calculated in miles gained or cities captured. Sometimes victory is just 18 hours of stubborn refusal to move.